I'm gonna start recording and kick us off. So good morning again, and welcome to Board Talk, a series discussing practices and ideas for nonprofit boards. I'm Seth Linden. I'm the founder and principal of Gather Consulting, and it's good to see a lot of familiar faces from last time and a bunch of new faces. So thank you for joining me today. Something worked. Either everyone hates their boards, everyone loves their boards, or everyone doesn't know what to do with their boards. But either way, it's a good, I'm glad this topic resonates. I'm grateful to be with you all here today. My hope is that the next hour will be an engaging and experiential time together, learning and reflecting and sharing our own experiences and expertise on how to set the virtual board meeting agenda. As I opened last time, these continue to be challenging times, and we are privileged to gather together to discuss board culture and governance. And in that spirit, I just want to take a moment to recognize again the frontline and health workers who are fighting the pandemic each day. So the essential question for today is, how do you craft a virtual board meeting agenda? And how do you demonstrate all three modes of effective board governance virtually? So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try to share my screen less than I did last time, but just to get us going. The agenda, again, similar to last time, we'll do some welcome and intros, who's in the Zoom room. We'll do some reflection on a Google Doc. What have we experienced recently with our boards? This time we're going to do some breakout rooms in our Zooms. We have some distinguished leaders, Marty Linsky, Melissa Balaban, and Marla Bobowick. I only choose names, leaders starting with M, and they're going to share some wisdom and facilitate some small groups. And then they will share out. I'll share a few tips from my experience and research, and then we'll do some closing and next steps. How does that sound? Don't really have a choice, even if it's not what you want. All right, the purpose and outcome and process. We're going to learn how to create better virtual board agendas. My hope after the hour is that we've all connected or reconnected with friends and colleagues on this call. I heard that was a real plus of the last workshop, is people seeing each other from all over the country. And then we'll discuss ideas and practices for articulating fiduciary, strategic, and generative questions for virtual board meetings. And the process, again, some intros, reflection, small group discussion, large group discussion, and then some Q&A. So like last time, just real briefly, some norms. Type any questions or resources that you have in the chat. So as an example, if you have a question for me or for anyone, type questions here. I'll try to get to them, and if not, I'll follow up next week. Also, like last time, we'll have a reflection doc, a Google Doc that we can just take a few minutes to ourselves and write and think about some of these questions, what we've been experiencing lately. And then, of course, if you're not speaking, please mute yourself. And if you need to take a break, and that's fine. If you're not going to be right here, just please turn your camera off when you're moving. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a sec. And I want to hear from you about who's here. So I'd love for you to write in the chat, and I'll do the same thing. Write your name, Seth Linden. Write your city, Long Beach. Write your organization, Gather Consulting, and your role. And then, if you can, write a question that you have, that you're curious about. My question is, how do we have generative conversations via Zoom? So thanks for populating that. While that's getting populated, I'll just share 30 more seconds for those new about my background. I'm a former teacher. I'm a nonprofit CEO, a board member, a foundation professional, and now a philanthropy and governance consultant. Gather Consulting works with philanthropists, CEOs, and foundation professionals and I advise on board culture, governance, and leadership development. My why, the reason I get out of bed in the morning, is I love connecting people and ideas so leaders can be their best selves. Also, my 4- and 7-year-old won't let me stay in bed too long. We have folks here, and I think I shared this the other day, so you all have this, but we have folks here from, 4 corners of the country, from Boston, New York, Baltimore, Chicago, Cambridge, Washington, D.C., LA, Florida. We have executive directors, we have CEOs, COOs, board liaisons, board chairs, board presidents, partners and principals. Folks are here from 2164 Philanthropy Advisors, American Jewish World Service, Baltimore City Public Schools, Hillel, Ben the Ark, Day Schools, Big Picture Learning, and Chrysalis. So a real range of nonprofit, for-profit, and public organizations. Let's move on to you all. So thanks for writing all that down. I'm going to call on a few people who don't know I'm going to call on them just so they can do quick intros. So it's not just me speaking this whole time. Toby, I'm going to start with you. Toby Rubin, would you mind just a quick intro and one question that you have for today? One sec. Go for it.
I had muted myself. So Toby Rubin, I live just outside of San Francisco. I have been a part of the lay leadership world since 1975. So a few years on a lot of different boards. I had the pleasure of building a board from scratch when I founded Upstart, and we utilized the governance as leadership framework for everything. And so very curious to see the update on that and new ideas. And I do executive coaching on a small basis for a very limited number of people at this point in my lifetime. But my question that I put in there is really like, much of the conversations I've had since COVID started around board work is, why is this night actually different than the other? It should always be well-crafted agendas. What is it about being virtual that changes, that is new, that is changing that? Is it maybe more about facilitation skills than crafting the agenda per se, because a well-crafted agenda should be thoughtful in many of the same ways. It's just that the practice may be different. Agreed.
And just a reminder, thanks, Toby. If you're not speaking, just to mute yourself so we can keep the background noise down. Thank you. Thanks, Toby. Debbie Cooper, can you introduce yourself and just share a question?
Sure, I just muted myself.
Unmute yourself now.
Sure, I'm Debbie Cooper. Professionally, I work for the Harold Grinspoon Foundation as the Director of Engagement for PJ Library. And in my personal life, I'm the board chair for Bernard Zell on Shamit Day School, which is a pluralistic Jewish day school in the city of Chicago. And what I've been wondering is similar to a question that was actually just posted, but really helping our board think about decision-making frameworks, making decisions with incomplete information, looking at sort of different types of planning, and how do we balance, how do we structure and run a board meeting when people are in such different places, sort of in their own lives and sense of control and sense of coping skills, and they're worried about themselves, but also trying to sort of help think about sort of the sustainability of the school, especially when we're dealing with parents who are of tuition and other types of stress for them, and the sort of longer term sustainability piece of the organization.
Thanks, Debbie. Good to see you. And let me see, Yachel, are you there? You want to do a quick intro and share a question?
Yeah, hi, Yechiel Hoffman. My question, I work for an organization that is both global in terms of our reach, but also in terms of our lay leadership. And so we have a lot of leadership that's reacting to a lot of different data from very different places, different cultures, different ways of thinking about what's essential and what's needed. And I'm really trying to think about how do I bring them together to start thinking in a more adaptive way about how this new reality is actually affording us the opportunity to think differently and make decisions differently, and get them out of like what's just happened in the last moment.
Thanks, Akhil. Good to see you. I'm going to share my screen for one more minute, just for a quick background, and before we reflect. Let's see here. Oops, there we go. Okay. A lot of you, I think many of you, have heard of governance as leadership, or these different modes of governing, the fiduciary, strategic, generative modes. 2 minutes just for those who haven't or who are not as familiar. Bill Ryan and his colleagues wrote a book called Governance as Leadership. It's influenced my thinking a lot during some recent research I was doing with Leading Edge and their Leading Places to Serve initiative. In a nutshell, Governance as Leadership states that there are 3 modes or 3 types of governance. Most boards do 1 to 2 modes fairly well. And yet the most successful, the healthiest, the most effective boards work in all 3 modes. And Ryan and his colleagues coined this term: when you're working in all 3 modes, you're kind of firing in all 3 cylinders. That's governance as leadership. So the 3 modes are fiduciary, strategic, and generative. Again, briefly, I'm gonna send a couple articles out after for those who are interested. The fiduciary mode is where boards are concerned primarily with stewardship of tangible assets. So type 1 constitutes the bedrock of governance. When you think of governance, you typically think of fiduciary governance, the work intended to ensure that nonprofit organizations are faithful to your mission, accountable to performance, and compliant with relevant laws and regulations. Without type 1, governance would have no legitimacy. If a board fails as fiduciary, the organization, not to mention its donors, clients, or community, could be harmed. So that's type 1. Type 2, strategic. The strategic mode is where boards develop a strategy with management to set the organization's priorities and course, and to deploy resources accordingly. Without type 2, governance would have little power or influence, and it would be more about staying on course rather than setting the course. And then finally, type 3, the generative mode, I think the hardest, is where boards, along with executives, frame problems and make sense of ambiguous situations, which in turn shapes the organization's strategies and plans and decisions. Because most organizations lack these frameworks and practices, it's easy for boards to become bystanders to it, even though it is central to governance. And I'll just share one more tidbit as an example. Just get my notes. And I'll share again this chapter with everyone afterwards. There's a great chart, again, just as example. So in fiduciary work, the board's core work is technical as it oversees operations and ensures accountability. In strategic governance, the board's core work is analytical. It's shaping strategy. It's reviewing performance. In generative governance, the board's core work is creative. It's discerning problems and it's engaging in sense making. The key question that you see right here, right? For fiduciary, it's what's wrong. For strategic, what's the plan? And for generative, what's the question? Finally, some performance metrics, which I find interesting when you're looking at fiduciary governance. You're looking at facts, figures, finances, and reports. When you're in the strategic mode, you're looking at strategic indicators, a competitive analysis. And when you're in the generative mode, there's signs of learning and discerning. So that's a quick background. I now want to, in a minute, I will again unshare the screen. We'll break out into groups. There's a Google Doc that you all had, or that I'll shared with you yesterday, and I'll share it with you one more time. We're going to discuss, and I'm going to give you all a few minutes to write and reflect. What were good examples of fiduciary questions at your last board meeting, or at the best board meeting you can think of? What were good examples of strategic questions? What were good examples of generative questions? What are the challenges when asking these questions? And how might we create better governance questions virtually? So your Google Doc should look like this. I'm going to stop sharing so you can all see it. And I'm going to give you about 3 minutes. I'm going to type this in here to write answers to those questions. and then we will break out into some groups. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes. I'm going to put the Google Doc down here again. Okay. 3 minutes till 10:20. Go for it. They're great. Take about 1 more minute.
I'm gonna have to listen to the rest of it on recording because I have to go to a teacher class.
Okay, thanks, Eddie.
So should I expect it?
Later today or Monday at the latest.
Okay, fantastic, because I have a board meeting on Wednesday. I want to listen to it first.
Okay.
Thank
Good
you
luck.
so much, and we'll see you next Friday.
You're welcome. Bye.
Seth, one question about ground rules.
Yeah.
Are we supposed to be thinking of this independent of the pandemic context, or trying to abstract from that as to what, on the assumption that we're going to be doing more meetings virtually, not because of the pandemic, but because of the experience we've had? I think those are different issues.
Yeah, and I'd encourage folks to think about it in your group, see where folks want to go. I asked the question thinking about how are things changing going forward. They are different, and yet a lot of the stuff that I've learned and experienced can be improved this way and actually can continue on in certain ways. So let's not pretend the pandemic is not happening. That's the whole reason that was the impetus for these virtual workshops. So how does that change our governance? How does that change our work together?
I mean, I think there is a kind of a middle bridge
Yeah.
question, which is, what have you learned in this experience that might be useful going forward?
100%.
Which is, because I find it's really hard to separate the more abstract question about virtual meetings from the moment that we're in.
Agreed. 100%. That's why you're here, Marty. So I want to just briefly introduce our facilitators, and then I'm going to break us out into rooms, which will hopefully work. So we'll start with Marty. Marty, thanks so much. Marty is a faculty, he's on the faculty at Harvard. He's the co-founder.
You promise no introduction, Seth.
30 seconds. 30 seconds.
15. Go for 15.
I'm just going to tell you our relationship. I met Marty while at the Jim
Okay.
Joseph Foundation. I interviewed him for some research on Jewish leadership, and we worked most recently together with Leading Edge on leading places to serve. So Marty, I really appreciate you being here. Melissa Balaban is the founder and CEO of eCar. We met also while I was at the Jim Joseph Foundation on a leadership retreat, walking in the woods. She's an LA native, a friend of the family, and Melissa's done extensive work with Rabbi Sharon Brous and the Jewish Emergent Network. And then finally, Marla Bobowick, she's a senior board source governance consultant. And Marla and I also met through our work with Leading Edge as a leading places to serve advisor. Marla has over 20 years of experience doing governance work with board source and beyond, researching and writing on multiple boards and subsectors. So I'm going to break you all into these Zoom rooms. There'll probably be about 8 to 10 folks in each room to discuss your reflections and anything else on your mind. Enjoy the informal conversations, really use them to explore ideas and questions together. And I'm going to give you all about, this is perfect. I'm going to give you all actually about 10 minutes. So we're going to come back at 10:33. So enjoy. I'm just going to continue assigning folks until everyone's in. Brandy, were you able to get into a room? And whoever's calling in from the Hartman Institute, were you able to get into a room?
Hi, Seth. Can you hear me?
Yeah, is it Brandy?
A minute.
Hey there.
Okay, here we go. Sorry, I was on another call and it was kind of an urgent matter came up with some
No
staffing
worries.
issues. And so I was like, I'm missing all this good stuff. I'm like, I see Google Docs and breakout rooms. So I'm not sure if I've missed too much to participate. I know it's recorded. I just want to check in before.
Yeah, no, for sure. Go. We're in breakout groups now. I think I have you assigned to breakout room 2. Do you
Yes.
see? Yeah. So I would join if you have the time.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I didn't want to be disruptive.
Sure.
So
No, thank you. And I don't know who's from the Hartman Institute. If you can hear me, you're welcome to join a breakout room right now for the next 5 or so minutes.
video account. I loaned them my video account, initially, to, have these meetings. And I think that's going to really change things, and to really have these conversations about, what are we learning that's valuable in what it means to build group and community and relationships within our boards, and the work that we do in, while having virtual communication being the best way to go about that right now, the human part of that.
Yeah. Tal?
Hi, I'm Tali Khazan, Board Liaison for American Jewish World Service. I think our board has been actually reacting pretty well to all of this. We clearly, like everyone, have been adding meetings. What I'm thinking is a bit, Marty, what you posed to the group earlier, which is kind of what can we take from this as we move forward? Because I think we have a lot of structures that were in place that have been extremely helpful now, and trying to figure out maybe if you break down the different questions, the fiduciary, strategic, generative, if we can address some of those in different structures, not necessarily a full in-person board meeting, and how we take that moving forward.
Do you have a proposal, Tali, or just put it out there as a thought?
Steph, where are you? I can't hear you. Yeah, you want to join a room?
I'm already in breakout room 3, but I went from my phone to my computer. Can you throw me in 3?
I'll throw you in 3. Yeah. There you go.
Thanks.
Yeah. I wanted to put you with Melissa, but I'm sorry that didn't happen.
Have one thing I decided like a couple weeks ago, that instead of starting off with like a heavy meeting, thinking about all the financial insecurity that we were going to be dealing with, we just did like a happy hour on a Friday before Shabbat, meet up on Zoom. And it was more of just like a check-in, catch up with everyone. And it really, I think, helped everyone feel like we're a team and we're in it together, and it wasn't just doom and gloom from the start. And I think that set a good tone for the rest, like moving forward, rather than me just coming to the board and being like, oh my God, we're in a disaster and we're not going to have any money. And what are we going to do? It was just like, oh, we had drinks and it was a Shabbat, and it was like just really nice, and checking in with everyone and sort of telling them what we were doing. And so I'll just share that.
That's great. I love that.
This is
I love
Joan.
that.
I think that for us, we have a
are an organization that is really focused on community engagement, and basically all of our work is centered around what the folks we meet with are telling us about their lives around Washington State. That's how we think about our strategy. And right now we can't really do community engagement. We can do some virtual meetings, but that's it. And so our board meetings are really focused on traveling to places around the state to meet with some of the folks that we've been learning from. So we can't do that. It feels like we're not, we're without kind of a center of focus. So we're cutting out that part, and then we're also cutting out some of our more other strategic conversations that feel like they'd be more effective in person. And we're just really focusing on one learning session, a few committee updates, the CEO report, so like those kind of critical pieces, and that's about it. And then we're designing a breakout as well, which I don't know kind of how to do a virtual breakout super effectively. This is actually a good experience for that. So
Great.
time of transition in the world to apply new strategy and efforts with them to, you know, take charge and kind of take lead. And so I'm going to take notes on all of our wonderful lay leaders that are here. Thank you guys for being here. Yeah, that's what we're here for.
Okay, thank you, Seth, for that indulgence.
Sure.
There were a couple of themes that were really interesting, I think, that came out in our going around the virtual room. One was that everybody nodded their heads about increased attendance, which is not a small point, right? And trying to think about what are the pressures that have so long driven us to non-virtual meetings, and you know what are the drivers of that, and are they really important, or are they more ego-driven and personal? And I love to fly in planes and stuff like that for national organizations. The second that was raised by someone who you knew intimately, Seth, was this question of intimacy, and this idea that there is a different kind of relationship in a virtual meeting, which is in some respects, and it'll be interesting to try to tease that out to see what could be preserved and why that's true, more intimate than a regular board meeting, which in my experience, what I was thinking of when Jim said that was how formal board meetings are. And here we're looking around and people are wearing their baseball hats and sitting in their homes, and you know, it's a different kind of ambiance. Saying that, those are a couple of themes that came out of our conversation. I wanted to share a couple of observations because I didn't get a chance to weigh in. From my own experience, I'm on 3 boards, and they're all facing very different kinds of situations. But there's one thing they have in common, which is that my experience is, and that is that the board in this time of crisis, which is not only a crisis, but is characterized by radical uncertainty. No one has any idea what is going to happen. And so what I found on all 3 boards is that we are cheerleading a lot. And that the senior CEO and senior staff need to know that we're there cheering them on rather than sharing the burden. You know, they're working full time. We all have our different journeys. And in all 3 of those boards, very different situations, the cheerleading role has become much more central. Second point I would make is that because everybody is on a very different journey, and because it's a very personal journey, and the situations are so different, not just organization to organization, but in our own lives. You know, some people like me are significantly inconvenienced, where there's other people are facing an existential crisis, personally, professionally, losing jobs, all of that stuff. That what I've found in all 3 boards is that there is an impulse to do a kind of a check-in, a personal check-in, which has been driven by the pandemic, but it has also created something different in the engagement around the conversation. People know where other people are at in a way that's different and seems very, very powerful to me. The third observation that I would make is that there is some tension on all 3 boards, different degrees, between short-term crisis planning and a kind of board's more typical vision, mission, long-term, what do we want to be when we grow up? And I had a conversation this morning with the executive committee and the CEO of one of these organizations, and we spent an hour really trying to sort out what was an appropriate role for the board under these circumstances and thinking of planning going forward, and what was an appropriate role for the CEO and the C-suite. So I just wanted to share those observations to kick off this part of the conversation. Thanks, Seth.
Thank you, Marty. That's great. Appreciate your or share out your synthesis and wisdom, as always. Let's go to Marla. Marla, can you share anything, some key takeaways that you heard, and maybe focus a little on fiduciary questions, or really just anything that you've learned from your many decades at BoardSource?
Don't make me older.
I don't know about
than
many
I am.
decades, 2 decades.
So I will share that the themes from our group had to do with some of just the logistics of shortening and redesigning board meetings. And I've always said that for my clients that already meet virtually, that's not the hard part. But for those that aren't used to the technology, is an extra level. I would say that what the group was talking about, and the theme was sort of focusing on contingency planning and fiduciary issues in this moment of crisis. And this may be driven as much by the organization's mission and stability in this world. And people seem to be, in our group, steering a little bit clear of the harder conversations about stakeholder community needs. I wouldn't say needs, but the strategic and community engagement side, and some of the the bigger issues, which is different than what I'm hearing from some of my clients. So I'll come back to that. Definitely increased communication, which I think is important, because people are reacting in different times and places. So it's a level of keeping the board informed. And I think that's, and you see it also just in all the organizations stuff that comes out. So I think that represents our group somewhat. I think the question is, how do you have a good strategic or generative conversation virtually, which can be harder. I will echo Marty's observation and comments from his group about the increased intimacy, trust. Seth and we had a conversation yesterday about this sort of evolving. There's more, I find, on Zoom, there's an increased equity of voice. So people that dominate a conversation in person tend to not do it as easily or much on Zoom, and that might be really healthy for organizations. I don't know how we'll do it when we go back, if there's pent up grandstanding, but this idea that you get to be a little bit more intentional about facilitating and making sure everyone speaks. My other observation is that people or in organizations, for some organizations, this is really expediting or putting them in a crash course on how to deal in a VUCA world, a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and especially when the information can be changing on a daily basis. And so that, combined with the organizations that may have been behind the 8 ball on some tough strategic programming choices. So one of the things I've heard among my other consulting colleagues in this nonprofit governance world and management world, and from my clients, is that as they have to prioritize, which is very hard, they are sort of really asking the questions, what do we absolutely have to do? And I will share one last thought, which is sort of my wish, is that this is a chance to really put the most important things on your agenda and let the procedural administrative stuff go by the wayside, without sacrificing the bonds and the relationship building among your board members and with the organization. So that's my take. Anyone from my group want to chime in? Let me know if I misstated things.
Thank you, Marla. That's great. Yeah, ditto. All right, and finally, Melissa Balaban, would love to hear from your group, or from you to share out from your group, key insights, and you know, curious, you are running an institution right now, and curious, you know, how, if and how your strategic priorities are changing in this time.
Yeah, thanks. A lot of quite similar themes in our group that, first of all, sort of the need for frequency and nimbleness, and really not sticking to a program that may have existed before all this. And also the personal connection. I think everybody in our group talked about how important having, you know, whether it's a Zoom happy hour with board members, or time to schmooze before the board meeting starts, or some level, or someone mentioned having board members, and we've done this too, connect to all the families in their community, in their school community, and we've done that as well. So like in this age of such disconnection, even at the board level, the personal connection has been so important, which we've seen everybody sort of say. So there's that bit, there's the nimbleness bit, which I think has been, I've felt like like every week seems like a month, and what you said on Monday could be completely different than what you're saying on Friday, and having partners with your board in that is so critical, because you know it's just changing so fast and we have to adjust so quickly, and it's great to have partners with the board in that adjustment rather than feel like you're dragging them along. And I've really felt that with our board chair and vice chair and our board. The other, I think, interesting challenge that we're facing as a community, and this might be somewhat unique to us, is that we have, you know, both a community that we're serving, but there's also the greater community that we feel connected and responsible for. And in this time of crisis and limited resources and all of that, how do you balance those things? How do you create a budget that reflects our morals and our values, that both serves our internally car community, but also really thinks about what's happening in the world and what our responsibility is to that world? And I think that's been a very interesting conversation, even in terms of our employees. You know, we've kept all of our maintenance employees employed, even though they can't do anything virtually. And so that's sort of the internal, but then there's what is our responsibility to do external things for the Los Angeles community, for the greater community. So that's been a big focus of our board over the past 6 weeks or so. And as we're all in budget season, I'm sure that's been a big conversation that we've been having, how to be focused on our strategic priorities, but also how do you do it through a moral framework and thought process.
Thanks, Melissa. That's great. Thank you all. Thanks, Marty, Melissa, and Marla. I'm gonna, let's see, we have about 11 minutes left. I still wanna go through a few notes and tips kind of that I've learned through my experience and just some recent research. And I still wanna try to end the formal conversation at 11, and I'll stay after if folks wanna chat or have more questions. I'm gonna go back into speaker view for a sec. Okay, let's see. So I thought some questions to guide a virtual board meeting agenda. Just as a quick example, I actually was a part of a board meeting a couple days ago, or yesterday, 2 days ago, the Jewish Studio Project. It was just a nice example. I'll share real briefly. It was 15 minutes of schmoozing prior, kind of like we had here. Then it was 15 minutes of just explicit check-in. How are you doing? How are you feeling? How are you coping? We had 15 minutes of the executive director just reflecting on the moment and how that's changing or not. You know, it's actually co-founders. Then we had 20 minutes of a budget discussion, and then a 60-minute strategy conversation. Similar small group, some reflection on our own time, small groups, and then large group, and then 10 minutes next step. It was 2 hours total, and it worked well. And then a few other just quick things, just guidance I heard last time, like what are we specifically doing differently or need to think about doing differently in this virtual time that we can't do, in person. So someone just emailed me the other day and I thought it'd be helpful to share here. So just meeting time, I think this may be obvious, but less is more. Especially on Zoom, people get fatigued and distracted. So keeping things tight and moving along, ending early or shortening the meeting if possible. Advanced reading, making sure people give time and notice to prepare and to read some materials ahead of time. So the meeting time can actually be used to ask questions and have a discussion rather than just reporting out. During the meeting, it's okay to have silence, and let people reflect on their own, write down some thoughts, especially when you're talking about big strategic questions, and then share. These small breakout rooms is a good example of kind of sharing with a few folks and then kind of sharing out loud to everyone else. This helps people gather their thoughts and just be a little bit more concise or comfortable in their ideas when they share. In terms of facilitating, just a couple notes from last week. be clear about how many minutes or sentences people have to share, and be specific. Are you asking for a question? Are you asking for a reflection? Are you asking for something else? Remind people again of the Zoom norms. Limit your shared screen time so people can see each other. I really do think people enjoy seeing each other's faces more than screens on the Zoom. Last couple, size, the smaller the better. I know, again, breakout rooms, if you can be in general, very intentional about the questions and activities you are asking from your board members. And just ask yourself, I think this was what Marla was just saying, what do I need most from my board right now? And set your agenda that way. And finally, this is also reflected, I think, in Marty's sharing, give your board members the opportunity to reflect about how they are doing in the moment. What are they grateful for? What do they miss? How are they coping? What will they carry forward with them when this pandemic ends? I think personal and reflective questions get people comfortable and more vulnerable with each other at the beginning, and allows for deeper, more authentic conversation. So for these last 5 minutes or so, I am going to share my screen one last time. Here we go. And just to share, there we go. Okay. I'm going to go through these quickly, and I'm going to share these afterwards. But I was thinking of, what are some good questions that might hit on the fiduciary, strategic, and generative modes to frame a virtual board meeting or virtual board agenda. And these questions I would say might be asked or answered by the chair, the CEO, the president, whoever's, in combination kind of running the meeting. So question 1, just checking time. Where are we in our annual budget? So looking at our numbers here, do we need to raise more money? Do we need to cut back expenses? Will we have a surplus this year? Are we putting any money into our reserve? A good discussion about budget and money is always important in a virtual board meeting and any board meeting. Question number 2, when does our money run out? So what's our cash flow look like? What's our monthly burn rate? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? How many months of runway do we have? How much is in the bank? I think that is especially pertinent now, as so many, especially smaller organizations are looking at that. Question 3, who is exercising leadership right now? Who's stepping up to the plate? How's the CEO doing? What does the CEO need? Who does the CEO lean on, professionally or otherwise, for mentorship? And who is stepping up on the board? Question number 4, as was mentioned, Melissa was talking about this. What are our strategic priorities? Are they changing? Do they need to change? How did we develop them? Is it time to review them? And are our priorities guiding how we're spending our money? Question 6, what's our fundraising plan? How are we raising funds? Does that need to change? Who's involved and how much are we trying to raise, and in what ways? Question 7, how do we best support our CEO? The chair-CEO partnership is paramount, as you all know. Does their CEO have a coach or a mentor? And does your board chair have a coach or mentor? Can they use each other as sounding boards? And does the chair appropriately support and push the CEO in the right ways? Question 8, what does our board look like in 5 to 10 years? That's a big question, but we want to use hyperbole, I think, in generative questions. It's also good succession planning. Who's on our board now? What skills, traits, characteristics, demographics do we need going forward? Question 9, what would our organization do without our board? And what would our board do without our organization? So what purpose and meaning and problem does our organization exist for? Would not having a board free you up or stress you out? And question 10, what would we do with a $50 million endowment? Think in hyperbole again. What would you do if you didn't have to fundraise? Where would you put the money? How much would you spend, and where? And finally, this question number 11 is a teaser for the part 3 of this series, is what would our board do in a pandemic? And that we'll talk about on May 15th, Friday, May 15th at 10 a.m. We have 3 minutes, so I'm gonna stop sharing. And if there are any specific questions that you all have, I'm happy to answer them now. And again, I will pause at 11 just to share a little next steps, and those who want to leave can leave, and those who want to stay on can stay on. But happy to get to any questions, and I'll scroll up here. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand or type a question into the chat box to everyone. I did see a question earlier from Jim Linden, if Jim is still here, about challenges for the chair in running a Zoom meeting. You want to share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, very quickly, we had a Zoom meeting this past week of the committee I'm sitting on, and one of the challenges was some people have a louder voice than others, just by nature of how they speak. And if there could be some way to organize, for the chair to organize who can speak next, whether raise your hand, so Jim is first, and then Marty, and then Stephanie, and then so on. So there's a little bit of order to it rather than a little bit more random. I think that would be something different than in a virtual meeting than it would be in a regular face-to-face meeting.
Thanks.
My experience has actually been that the people who are good at butting in real meetings are also good at butting in the Zoom meeting. The patterns replicate themselves.
Well, and I would add to that, one of the ways to manage it. Oh, sorry.
I was just saying that's the beauty of mute all that the
Right.
host has, and setting up the protocol of, you need to unmute yourself, or there's actually a hand raising function on Zoom. I mean, that's, it's learning the technology, I think, is really important for all the board members who usually won't show up for, learning how to run a good meeting. But at this point, they need to show up for this stuff.
Stephanie?
One of the things that I found real helpful is to be sure that the board chair and the executive director, whatever your two leaders are, either have the chat function going on the side or commit to having their cell phones next to each other so they can text. Because if you usually do your board meetings in person and you sit next to each other, you could pass little notes, you can whisper. If you want to say, I want Dan to participate a little bit more, or why don't we call on Melissa or something like that, you can't do that. So to be sure that you continue to have a little way of chatting with your board chair.
Can I just add to that? One board that I work on has the CEO and the board chair have a text message going on. So they set up a text for three of them, and they keep texting back and forth during the meeting.
Well, this is Marlon. I would add that can work, I think, for chairs and people who are not good at multitasking or not comfortable with some of the technology. Having another person assigned to help, who's really clearly there to help manage that, can be really helpful. So when you talk about facilitation, you have a note taker, you have a timekeeper to dole out some of that work to other people.
Yeah.
Can I just add one other thing? This seems silly, but we're all going to look back on how did we respond differently during this time. And I like taking pictures of everything we've done so that we remember. And so in any meeting that I've had where I've wanted a picture of this, the screenshot of all of your great faces, I always assign somebody ahead of time. At X point, will you be sure to take a picture of the team? So I don't like to tell everyone we're doing it, but we're going to want to look back and remember all the creative things that we figured out how to do.
I like that.
This is Joan. If I could sort of add one thing, which was interesting, both in our small group and on this, it seems to me that, what I heard from everybody was this sort of thirst for communication. And in some ways, this feels like it's a great outlet for people to be coming together. And what I'd love for us all to think about is how do we keep that thirst for communication and how it's applied to our boards or whatever it is, and continue to move that forward. As we all get back out into, sort of being in the same physical spaces with other people.
Great. I want to respect everyone's time. I'm going to hang out, but for those who need to leave, I just want to say thank you. Speaking of just these last couple reflections, sometime today or later, just reflect, like, what did you learn? Write it down, share it, meditate on it, but hopefully you learned something new in the last hour. Think about who you want to follow up with. there's, and let me know if you don't want your email shared with anyone, but there's incredible resource and experience and expertise on this call. So please use each other for support. You know, we all have the same questions. I'm going to send a very brief 3-question survey. It'll take 2 minutes to fill out later today. And then finally, I'll share slides and emails next week. Our last board talk is Friday, May 15th at 10 a.m. It's going to be on boards and pandemics, responding with urgency and planning for the future. Thank you all again for attending, especially, and thank you especially to our facilitators, to Marla, to Melissa, to Marty, who I think had to Zoom off real quick. If you have more questions, I'm around until 11:15, but thanks again, everyone, and stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks, Seth.
My pleasure. Shabbat shalom. I'm going to stop the recording also.